Welcome, everyone. My name is Ishmael Hodges, um, right here on Substack. I'm sure some of you are here from Matthew's side of the fence. So I guess broadly, you could say I fall under philosophy, but I'm pretty all over the place. I just kind of write about whatever the hell I want to. But a decent amount of time, yeah, I write some sort of philosophy from a kind of a noob perspective. Just a tiny bit of background because I'm sure a lot of you are maybe really heavily into these topics, such as things we're going to be talking about today. Um, I typically am coming to these things pretty fresh. I've I'm not formally educated in philosophy, and I've only been sort of seriously trying to learn and sort of tackle philosophy for about a year now. Um, so I feel I'm able to talk decently well about it, but occasionally you'll probably hear me say some things and you'll be like, "What?" And so that that hopefully explains it. Um, but um, but yeah, I'm joined today by Matthew David Segall. I'll kick it over to him in just a moment for him to sort of further introduce himself, because I'm always nervous that if I try to introduce someone, I'll mess up some part of their, where they work and their pedigree and things like this. So, yeah, Matthew, for people on my side of the fence, would you care to sort of introduce yourself and let people know kind of what you're up to?
Yeah, sure, Ishmael. Grateful for the invitation to do this with you. I've
Oh yeah,
appreciated
absolutely.
and entering into the fray, and you have a fresh perspective on these things, so I'm excited about this. But yeah, I am an academic philosopher. I'm associate professor at a university in San Francisco, California Institute of Studies, which is been around 60 years, but prior, I call it the prior institutional incarnation, American Academy of Asian Studies that started in the 50s during the San Francisco Renaissance, founded by a student of the Indian revolutionary turned yogi Sri Aurobindo. Um, Students named Haridas Chowdhury was the first president. People like Alan Watts out
Mm.
there. So it has a neat history, and I teach in the philosophy department there. And most of my research orbits around the process philosophy of Alfred Whitehead and its applications across the natural sciences and religious studies. Um, and I also doing sort of philosophy for a long time since I was even before I was a graduate student, an undergrad. I got into YouTube uh, just before Google bought it, and I discovered a um, para-academic philosophical community there. And so this was about 20 years ago that I started. So I'm a major advocate for philosophy being done outside the ivory tower and being done in public. And I don't think that any disadvantage, someone like you wouldn't have, academic pedigree or training or degrees in philosophy, because coming at these ideas with just your natural intellectual instincts, I think is so important because academic philosophy can get really entrenched in completely irrelevant, nitpicky distinctions that don't really matter other than a lineage or a school of thought or whatever. And so I think this sort of thing you're doing is super.
Yeah, very cool. I just want to check with chat real quick. I'm getting a bit of breakup on your voice, sort of on the ends of your words. Is that just on my end? I'm wondering, or is I don't know if anybody in chat can sound off real quick. It might just be a connection thing.
If I switch my mic, does that make any difference? Is that better or worse?
That's better, I believe.
Uh, is that better? Okay. I'll
Yeah, I think
keep
so.
that on. Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay. No, yeah, it's always
Hopefully,
tough. Yeah, it's always tough with
hopefully
these
that clears
things.
it up.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
should be a bit better. Um. Okay, so as I said, I've been sort of doing kind of like a crash course in a lot of these different things, and as I'm a bit older. a lot of it for me has been sort of not so much learning about things in a way of saying like, oh, what are all the ideas out there? And let me pick one, you know. So I'm not really like shopping philosophy. I'm essentially more trying to just learn. And a lot of it has been because I'm, 41 now. I think that I have a sort of my own kind of philosophy I've formed over the course of my life. And it's more about me sort of learning where a lot of that puts me sort of among the different philosophical traditions. That doesn't mean that my views haven't, changed a lot as time has gone on as well. Um, but I think a lot of what I've been doing is sort of orienting myself. And I've been particularly struck by sort of learning about Whitehead. I'm in the process of reading Science in the Modern World right now. I've been listening to some of your conversations. Um, and I'm really excited to hear you maybe explain in a simple way, or, as simple as maybe you can, just to sort of set the background for people, not just who Whitehead was, but sort of where he sits in relation to perhaps some other schools of thought that people might be a bit more familiar with. Because as I've been listening to some of your conversations, I get sort of the impression that um, Whitehead Whitehead sort of hit the scene at his time, and it wasn't like he was ignored or anything, but it really seems like it's kind of his work is sort of aged like a fine wine in some ways. Where
I love
maybe
that metaphor.
yeah, he was like maybe a bit of ahead of his time, I think, in his thinking. And so we're maybe more broadly, we're sort of landing in a position now where more and more people are going, oh, wait a minute, this kind of reminds me of, something that this guy was talking about. So could you maybe just set out sort of a basic background for where Whitehead sits, sort of growing out of sort of the broader context of what's called process philosophy. So maybe if you could start there for people and sort of give a quick rundown of what process philosophy is, and maybe how that differs from how your average person that's just sort of coming to philosophy when they encounter analytical philosophy or continental and things like this. Maybe they're more used to those. Maybe you could sort of lay out the differences and what process philosophy kind of brings to the table.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'll keep it as simple as I can, but Whitehead says at one point, maybe it's in Science in the Modern World, he says, seek simplicity, but distrust it.
Mm,
So
I like that.
process philosophy goes all the way back to the origins of Western philosophy in ancient Greece. Heraclitus, Panta Rei, all is flux. You never step into the same river twice because you're not the same person, and the river has changed as well. So, and then there's Parmenides, right, who articulates this view of being such that anything that exists already exists, and not being or non-being can't even be conceived really. And so that's a conception of reality wherein everything is kind of eternally as it is, and the role of the philosopher is to see through the illusion of change to access that unchanging being. Whereas Heraclitus says, no, we're always going to be in this flowing, becoming world. If you want a metaphor for what reality is, it's an ever living fire. It's a giant conflagration, and everything's being turned into everything else all the time. That basic division is almost it's like a characterological difference, or a shift, a difference in the attitude of the philosopher. It's almost a metaphilosophical stance before you even get into trying to resolve particular problems. And so process philosophy, I think, is best thought of as it's like a metaphilosophical attitude, right?
Mm,
How do you even approach this question of, or these questions of what is being, what is truth, what is justice? And so Whitehead's in the Heraclitean lineage, although it's not like he's dismissing what Parmenides was talking about. Whitehead famously says all of European philosophy can be safely characterized as a series of footnotes to Plato. So Whitehead is a Platonist, and Plato, I think, was one of the first to attempt to synthesize the Parmenidean view and the Heraclitean view, to say, okay, clearly there is flux and clearly there is, say, form. How can we account for our own attempts to know the world, and how can we account for what appears to be the structure of the world in light of these two competing perspectives? And so over the millennia, there's been a sense in which I think the Parmenidean view has tended to dominate philosophy, but process philosophy has always been this subterranean stream that bursts through the surface now and then to shake things up. If we go to the 19th, late 18th, early 19th century with German idealism, I think there's a sense in which many of those thinkers started to rediscover the importance of becoming, whether it's Friedrich Schelling or Georg Hegel. There's a real sense of needing to recognize history and evolution and creativity in a way that the substance-based ways of thinking that go back to Parmenides and Plato and Aristotle needed to be challenged. And so process philosophy is usually opposed to substance ontology. Process ontology and substance ontology are like pitted against each other in terms of our understanding of what there is. And now Whitehead, just to situate him a little bit, he was a Cambridge Don, taught mathematics for 25 years at Cambridge University. And in the early 20th century, the first decade of the 20th century, he was a collaborator with Bertrand Russell, who started as his student and quickly became his peer. And Principia Mathematica is an attempt to, it's part of what used to be called the Logicist project, to ground mathematics and eliminate all of the intuitive leaps that might be required to engage in mathematical reasoning. And particularly in the Principia, it was arithmetic. They wanted to ground it in logic so that there's no need for any intuition. It's like, no, we could program a computer, as we would say now, to follow logical steps without any need for missing context or all the stuff that, the messiness of human thinking can lean on. And that project was both a tremendous success because it showed the power of this new analytic method of philosophizing and led to the birth of analytic philosophy, you might say. There were precursors like Frege, a German philosopher that Russell was engaging with. But that text, the Principia, really does give rise to this method of logical analysis. So great success. It was also a tremendous failure because they ran into all of these paradoxes. And it turned out they wanted to prove logically that 1 + 1 = 2, which is a simple arithmetic operation that a child knows is true. But it turns out there's a lot of presuppositions built in there. And it turned out that they ended up with this mess of paradoxes. They tried to patch them. Russell was kind of devastated by this. And Whitehead was liberated by it, is how I typically frame it. And all of a sudden, this mathematician and logician is inspired to think about deeper philosophical and metaphysical questions. Also happening at that time, the first decade or two of the 20th century, there were some revolutions in physics, relativity theory, that Einstein was developing with the special theory and then the general theory, and then the birth of quantum physics. And Whitehead was drawn more and more into the philosophy of science as a result of these shifts in physics, because he realized that the old mechanistic metaphysics, which had held sway since the time of Galileo and Descartes and Newton, no longer made any sense in light of the relativity of space and time and the discovery of quantum entanglement and non-locality, which was just beginning to get worked out then. But nonetheless, Whitehead saw the writing on the wall and went to work developing a better philosophy of science and a better metaphysics, which would account for these shifts in physics. And so in the 1920s, he starts writing a lot of books about the epistemology that relativity theory would suggest and what changes science needs to make in terms of how it understands what measurement is and so on. And then by 1925, he'd been invited to Harvard University after more or less retiring from teaching in the UK. He goes over and becomes an American philosopher. So I'd say he's a British mathematician and an American philosopher. And that's not just because he taught philosophy at Harvard for almost 15 years, but because he was deeply influenced by William James, John Dewey, and the American pragmatist tradition, what's called radical empiricism. It's different from classical empiricism. We can get into that. And he was also influenced, I'll mention, by Henri Bergson, who was an important process philosopher in the 20th century as well. At the time, first half of the 20th century, he's probably the most famous philosopher in the world at that time, Bergson. So Whitehead loved Bergson, had some tweaks he wanted to make to Bergson's philosophy. Russell hated Bergson, called him anti-intellectual. Whitehead says in the beginning of his 1929 book, Process and Reality, which is his magnum opus, he wanted to rescue Bergson from the charge of anti-intellectualism. So we can get into all of this more, but that's basically Whitehead's trajectory. And I would say, last thing I'll say is, in the 1920s, you have analytic philosophy moving in this direction of more or less positivism. You've got the Vienna Circle, misunderstanding Wittgenstein, although Wittgenstein is the type of guy who just felt like everyone misunderstood him. And basically saying that philosophy is just linguistic analysis. We can't really ask these metaphysical questions because we have no empirical data to work with to assess the claims, and any metaphysical statement that doesn't refer to something empirical is nonsense. Right? So the logical positivists are going in that direction, mostly in the Anglo world, Anglo-American philosophy. But then on the continent, you have thinkers like Heidegger, who similarly are more interested in what he called Dasein, this clearing wherein sort of human experience is situated, and all we can really talk about philosophically is what human beings have access to. And so these larger cosmological questions also can't really be addressed from the more phenomenological point of view. Phenomenology is not metaphysics, right? It's not asking what's going on beyond our experience. It's asking, well, let's just describe the structure of our experience. Valuable pursuit. But Whitehead's trying to do something different. He's still grounded in experience, but in a way that's different from phenomenology. And so he's articulating this grand metaphysical scheme and this new cosmological perspective in the wrong season, as it were. And I think in many respects, his philosophy has been in cold storage for decades, and it's finally being reheated and its relevance rediscovered. But it's hard to place him. He's not exactly a pragmatist. He's not exactly an analytic philosopher, though he definitely is using some of those methods. And he's not a continental philosopher. He's not a phenomenologist. So because he lacked the context in that sense, he had to start his own school of thought. And that, I think, has led to all the difficulties associated with trying to popularize his ideas, because it's unique, and it takes a lot of effort. It's a heavy lift to become conversant in the language that he created. He wrote in English, but it's not always easy to understand what he's trying to say. So.
Yeah, I think he's a very beautiful writer. I'm really enjoying reading him. But and maybe we can, in a moment, we can talk about some of the core kind of concepts like prehension. I do think in terms of sort of the moment that he might be starting to have, I think it makes a lot of sense, because I think that people who are interested in these sort of topics, sort of before, and not even necessarily, because obviously like quantum physics has been being worked on for quite a while now, but I feel like interest in it has been sort of steadily increasing. You've got really popular podcasts like Theories of Everything with Kurt Mongol. And so I think the public is becoming sort of increasingly aware of sort of the constant work that's being done to bridge the gap between classical physics as we were all sort of, that I was taught about as a kid, and then some of the, very sort of strange things that seem to be the case in quantum physics. And so, yeah, it makes total sense to me that someone like Whitehead, who was willing to sort of take like a very, very big swing, you know, um, maybe at the time, as you said, maybe the context wasn't really there for it. But now that people are sort of finding themselves in a position, because I think like just as human beings, I think any sort of incongruence really bothers us. We naturally want to make sense of things. We want to have some sort of a framework that we can fit everything within and sort of like see how the pieces, relate to each other. And in a bit of my early now reading of him, and like I said, listening to some of your stuff, um it really is like the biggest of swings in a way, because he really just is incorporating, literally almost everything. He speaks about aesthetics, about religion, like he's trying to really make sense of like kind of the whole picture. But I did want to go back and press, because as I said, with me being new to these things, when I hear empiricism, I think just the very, sort of traditional, very, very narrow sort of a mindset. And so, as a relative noob to these things, when I look at the work of someone like Whitehead, something like any form of empiricism is not something that really factors in. Like I can see where he was trying to pay like full respect to science and trying to incorporate its strengths and pay honor to it. But you spoke about sort of the difference between the different forms of empiricism. So could you maybe flesh that out for me just a little bit more?
Yeah. So, you have famous figure like David Hume, who's an articulator of a form of empiricism that's based on an analysis of sensory experience, where what's considered to be the raw data of sensation are like bare patches of color, or the tone of sound. And the idea for Hume is that we have I'll call them bare sensory universals. And by that, I just mean we have a patch of red and a patch of yellow. That same shade of yellow could show up in any experience. So that's what I mean by universal. And then what the mind does for an empiricist in the lineage of Hume would be to associate these raw sensa, the sensory data, into more complex forms based on habit. And so all of our ideas, including all of our concepts, all of our categories, are what Hume would call faded impressions. Everything originated in the senses, and the only distinction Hume would make between something that we're sensing or perceiving in the world and something that we're reflecting on, an idea or a concept, is it's the force and vivacity of it, of the experience of it. So if it's real out there and we're perceiving something happening in the world, Hume would say, oh, it's more forceful, it's more it has more life to it, as it were. And then concepts are kind of dried out, and it's just the husk of what had been the sensory experience. And so we could already question, oh, sometimes, especially if you take a few hundred micrograms of LSD, all of a sudden the force and vivacity of your own imagination becomes way more powerful than anything out in the sensory world. Although, of course, you can get quite absorbed in your sensory experience too. But the idea there is that sensation comes to us in these like atoms, basically, these separate bits of data that then get associated by the mind. Now, what someone like William James argues, who's also an empiricist, but he calls it radical empiricism, is that we don't just perceive this aggregate of separate bits of sensory data, we perceive relations, which is to say we perceive, first and foremost, a sort of flow of experience. He called it the stream of thought or the stream of consciousness. And what Whitehead does with this is he goes back to David Hume, and Hume famously argues against this more or less Newtonian or scientific understanding of causality, that Newton was looking for necessary and universal causes, like with his law of universal gravitation and so on, and wanted this to be grounded empirically. And Hume says, look, when you look at your empirical experience, we don't have a sensation of causality. Causality is an idea that we make up by the force of the association of our sensory experiences. And so it's more or less a matter of custom or habit that we think that cause and effect operates in the natural world. Now, that might seem good enough for a kind of instrumentalist understanding of science. It's like good enough. It allows us to make models, but we don't know if they're really true. But they make good predictions. That's good enough for some scientists. But Newtonians, physicists, they want to know that causality is how nature itself is operating. It's not just our way of looking at things by force of habit. But Hume's analysis is that, watch one billiard ball hit another billiard ball. What you see is a constant conjunction, he would say, but you don't see a necessary causal relationship there. And so what Whitehead points out, though, is that, Hume would say, look, we see with our eyes. And when we see with our eyes two billiard balls hitting each other, okay, we don't necessarily perceive a necessary causal connection there. But Hume's already said that we see with our eyes, and that witness is itself already an experience of causation, Whitehead would say. So, you walk into a dark room and flip on the light switch and your eyes blink because it's so bright. We know we see with our eyes because of that. And we're directly experiencing the relationship between light and our eyes and our experience. And Whitehead would point out that Hume's already assumed this direct encounter with causation in his experience with a relation, and then goes on to deny it in the next breath. And so this is what a radical empiricism is trying to do, that we have to not approach our sensory experience so abstractly. And Whitehead analyzes perception in a really, I think, helpful way. He's not a phenomenologist, but he's nonetheless engaged in a form of philosophy that springs from experience. But he points out that David Hume and the whole tradition of philosophy after him has made experience seem like it's resting upon, like its base is this abstract form of sensory experience of the external world, of surfaces. But before that, there's actually a more primitive form of perception that he calls causal efficacy, which he also calls bodily reception, and that we feel the transmission of feelings through our bodies before we have any definite sense of a shade of blue or a shade of yellow or a texture or whatever. And so Whitehead says, philosophers have been obsessed with their visual experience, and they've totally neglected their visceral experience, emotion, for example. And so all of a sudden, rather than the raw data that philosophy has to work with to understand the nature of reality in terms of constructing epistemology, isn't just based on raw sensory percepts, but instead is based on this deeper sense of visceral experience, including emotion, whereby we feel more plugged into the surrounding environment rather than like outside observers, which visual experience is, of all the senses, is more prone to making us imagine that we stand outside the world and are looking in at it. Whereas touch or taste or smell very much requires a sense of intimate connection and a participation with the world around us. And so radical empiricism is trying to surface what got backgrounded by these original or classical forms of empiricism, to look a little bit deeper at the texture of experience.
Yeah. It's very
Does that
interesting
make
to think
sense?
about. Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to think about because I started thinking about, I think it's been sort of percolating my mind for a bit because I started reading a bit about a bit of the work of Helen Keller, some of her writing. Because it suddenly struck me, I knew that she'd done some writing, obviously, later in her life. And I started really wondering, I was like, did she really talk about sort of her memory of what it was like before. Everybody knows about the scene from The Miracle Worker with, well, Wawa and the water running over her hand. Um, and she wrote, I can't remember exactly. She wrote really beautifully about how, essentially the sort of like the symbolic, like we're so visually focused in our thinking, but sort of the symbolic, powerful image for her is that of a hand, and she speaks about it like very beautifully and very poetically because her hands were her primary way of interacting with the world.
Yeah.
And it really struck me because I was like, so much when we talk about consciousness, and because I wrote a piece, criticizing panpsychism. I've had hours and hours of conversation with some of my friends who are panpsychists. um and I have come to realize that, though, that like when we think about consciousness, we tend to have like a host of sort of kind of entailments, I think, that come along with it, um where I think it's mentally useful to maybe think about that almost in a Helen Keller kind of a way, where, okay, think about your own consciousness and what that feels like and all these sort of things. And okay, so what happens if you sort of slice your visual experience off of that? Okay, what's left then? Okay, now what happens if you slice away your auditory experience? What's left after that? And once you sort of start paring it down, um I think I've found that useful, and I'm not a panpsychist, but I think that there's this big battle, and we can get on to, maybe we can move on to next, because I think people are, because of Philip Goff and people like that, they're maybe increasingly familiar with panpsychism, and sort of, I think the more popular forms are like microconstitutive panpsychism, things like this. And I think one of the biggest leaps that people find difficult is when they hear something proposed like, reality is conscious, or reality is consciousness, or sometimes the same thing with like, idealism, whether it's from Bernardo Castro or something like that, mind at large, all these things. You do have what can be sort of a linguistic problem, but I found it helpful to think of it in these terms of like, typically, once again, you can never speak for all of any particular group, but typically when panpsychists are talking about, reality being sort of fundamentally conscious, they're not they're not talking about conscious necessarily in the same way as, we tend to think in terms of ourselves. And I think that once you begin to sort of slice away the types of sort of visual sense, not even just visual, but just sensory experience that comprises much of our own experience of our own consciousness, I think you do end up at this conclusion that, like, well, even if it's something like and I know that a sensory deprivation tank doesn't completely remove, sensory input, but it's significantly reduced. Um, I think there's some very interesting stuff to press on there, because people find that useful, but oftentimes people enter like a sort of state of like blind panic as well, because so much of how we sort of orient ourselves in the world is based on, okay, I can see what's around me. And I think that sort of panic sense of not being able to see, not being able to hear, shows maybe on a psychological level how viscerally, sort of, emotionally supportive in a biological sense our ability to kind of navigate our environment is. And as I was reading,
Mhm.
and I'm still in sort of the early stages of Science in the Modern World by Whitehead, but this isn't a quote, but he has a phrase where he sort of proposes thinking of matter in a very similar way as we might think of something like color and light and these other, sort of experiences that we have, as a matter being sort of like a label for like a continuous vibratory state that, persists through time, something along those lines. Um, but I feel like your average person sort of takes much more, puts more stock maybe in their experience of matter than they do of something like light.
Mm.
What do you think that's rooted in? Do you think it's rooted in something like the fact that we're quite aware that, like, should we be blinded, we wouldn't experience light anymore. Should we be deafened, we wouldn't experience sound anymore. But it's much more difficult for people to think about not experiencing matter. Do you think that that's sort of at the root of why once you start of questioning, like, the nature of matter, it bothers people in a way maybe that, is a much more visceral reaction than maybe questioning their experience of light and such?
Mm. Yeah, that's a very rich question. You know, I would say matter is among the most abstract ideas ever invented by the human imagination. Uh, our only access to it is through our experience, right? And we've, I think, in our contemporary culture, because of the cultural prominence of science, it's very easy to think that matter is the most concrete thing that there is. Um, but that would be Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness, I would say. And if you go back to the 17th century, and Rene Descartes, and the dualism between res cogitans and res extensa, he's basically defining matter as this extended substance in a very idealistic way. It's pure geometry, pure measurability, as it were. That's what matter meant for Descartes. You can't measure the soul, but you can measure the external world using the tools that he invented, the analytic geometry and the coordinate grid and all of this. And that the origins of the idea of matter in his attempt to turn nature, the external world, into something that could be mathematized and basically reduced to the sorts of terms that his rational understanding would find itself amenable to. So in other words, nature becomes pure knowability, right? Because it's just geometry. That it's obviously when you go back to the founding of this idea, you can see how idealist it is. Matter is quite abstract in Descartes' way of rendering it. And while, in the 20th century, very few scientists would defend Cartesian dualism, they're nonetheless inheriting this idea of nature or the physical as something that can be exhaustively mathematized.
Mm.
And Whitehead's protest against that is just, well, obviously, this is a very powerful method. He was a mathematical physicist himself and arguing with Einstein about the proper interpretation. Like, literally, they met and argued in 1921 about the proper interpretation of relativity theory. And so Whitehead's not a mathematical slouch or anything. He took the methods of mathematical physics very seriously. But, he would say, nature is not a bloodless dance of numbers. Real facts are happening out there. And how do we account for that? He's a realist. He doesn't want nature to just be a geometrical grid. We can model it using mathematics, but it's not mathematics, right?
Mm.
There's real, we could say, bodies out there. There's real organisms populating the earth. And, you mentioned light, which I think that's an interesting way of getting at this, because light has no mass. Is it material? Is it physical? Well, I mean, it's studied by physics, but what the hell is it? Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Well, it depends how we look at it. And so this is one of the things that quantum physics brings to the fore, is the fact that you can't remove the observer and the method of observation from the practice of science, right? We're a part of what we're trying to study. And so I think the allure of panpsychism, which there are a variety of panpsychisms, some of them I don't like. And it's a bit of a gamble on my part, a risk to say, well, I'm defending a form of panpsychism, and here's why it's different from the other forms. Maybe it would be better for me to say, this isn't panpsychism, this is something else. Whitehead never used the term. He never referred to himself as a panpsychist, but he does say, outside the experience of subjects, there's nothing, 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 bare nothingness, direct quote, right? He doesn't mean human subjects. For him,
Yeah.
subject and object is generalized beyond
Yeah.
any sense of a conscious human subject. But when we think about light, Whitehead's wager is that this experiential approach to the understanding of the transmission of energy through nature would allow us to relate to something. An example I like to use is, when you feel sunlight on your cheek, you feel that warmth, brings you some joy uh, for the first 20 minutes, and then you might start to get a sunburn. But initially, you're feeling light. And Whitehead would say, well, what if, yes, your body and your nervous system is translating this energy into a form that, you know, millions of years, billions of years of evolution have helped to filter and organize and so on. But maybe it's not totally a hallucination of your organism, but that you're actually feeling what it's like to be light. You're feeling a little bit of what it's like to be the sun as a result of this relationship that you're feeling, the warmth on your cheek, right? And now that sounds crazy to a physicalist, but if we really want to examine what nature is beyond just the numbers and the equations that physics used to study it, which I assume most physicists are not happy with this idealistic view that comes out of Descartes, that nature is just made of geometry. Geometry is abstract. It's created by human minds, right? So if we want to really ask, well, what is nature? What are these equations describing? Whitehead's answer is the transmission of feelings in a very structured way that can be mathematized, especially in the physical world. Once you get to the biological world, things get way more complex because organisms are agents. They don't, every bacterial cell and certainly, every animal is unique, responds based on its own history, whereas in physics, every hydrogen atom can be treated like every other hydrogen atom for the purposes of the equations. There's no unique historicity to each hydrogen atom, at least, again, for the purposes of physical models. Biological world is different. But how do we maybe take a lesson from biology, where I think most people would say animals are conscious? Maybe not everyone's ready to say that even single cell, protists and amoeba and bacteria are conscious, but why not? I mean, they're, if you look at them under a microscope, they do seem to be animal-like in the way they navigate an environment. What makes that unconscious and an animal conscious? But if we take a lesson from biology and generalize that into physics too, Whitehead says in Science in the Modern World, biology is the study of the larger organisms. Physics is the study of the smaller organisms. I mean, astrophysics is the study of very large organisms like stars and galaxies. But why not generalize this idea of organism, and with it, the understanding that there's some kind of experience intrinsic to how these bodies, how these systems organize at all scales in nature? Because then we have at least something more tangible to say, oh, this is what nature is made of, so to speak. It's made of experiences. It's made of experiential perspectives and transmissions of feeling. And that's what light is. It's a transmission of feeling. Whitehead has a technical term, prehension, which is a non-conscious experience, a non-conscious feeling. A lot of people have issues when they say, oh, so when you say Whitehead's a pan-experientialist, but most experience is not conscious, that seems like a contradiction in terms. Like, by definition, to experience is to be conscious. But Whitehead's making a distinction. And one way of getting at that is, like, until I mention it, you're not conscious of the fact that your butt is pressing against the chair. But there was a feeling happening before I mentioned it. Just wasn't conscious. So there's non-conscious feelings happening all the time, right? Just it's not available to our ego. But there's a whole swarm of things going on. Thankfully, our ego helps us pay attention to what matters and is relevant to us. So that's how I would explain what Whitehead's doing with his form of panpsychism.
Yeah, I think what I like about it, and you're obviously far more knowledgeable, and so what I'm about to say, I'm saying it kind of metaphorically. I know it maybe doesn't map exactly onto sort of the history of philosophy, but as I've been sort of examining the different kind of, what do you call, I guess you'd call, like, the main monisms of idealism, panpsychism, physicalism, it sort of struck me that I think in the terminology and kind of conceptually, it feels to me like this sort of split that, in a way, at least conceptually, kind of almost happened in response to dualism. And like I said, maybe this doesn't map the history of it exactly, but hopefully I can still make my point with it. That in dualism, well, Cartesian dualism, you have this concept of, as you said, of res extensa, res cogitans. And it struck me that it seems like, in a way, all of the monisms are, by definition, they're rejecting dualism. But it seems like they still are kind of accepting the terms in some way, where um, physicalism is almost saying, okay, we reject dualism because of the interaction problem. So you could say that physicalism is essentially saying, okay, everything is extensa and it should be viewed through the lens of extensa. And then when you look at certain forms of idealism and such, it almost feels like the opposite, where instead of putting this emphasis and this sort of the weight of your sort of presumption of importance on the world, like physicalism tends to do, and trying to sort of achieve this sort of like almost third person stance on the self, and to like be as objective as possible. Like I think that seems to be their goal, is to sort of presume more the existence of the world as being, like, it's difficult to say, like, more important than the existence of myself, like looking at myself as it relates to the rest of the world. Whereas idealism, in particular, Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism comes to mind. It seems like this sort of like inverse kind of extrapolation, where it's like, well, all I can be really certain of is myself and my own experience, and therefore I'm going to view the rest of reality in the terms of mind, mind at large. Everything is mentation, these kind of ideas. And it struck me that they rejected, there's a rejection of dualism, but it seems like maybe it's still carrying some of the, maybe those views are still carrying some of the basic assumptions forward, which I think I sent you that little thing that I had written yesterday. Sort of this idea of metaphysics that are conceptually based in something that is an idea that's like a substance, and that I'm using that word very loosely. Um, and so I think I've grown to realize that the problems inherent in substance views. But I think, harkening back to what I was saying about how our experience of matter is maybe our most concrete of our experiences of our environment, I think that it's really natural for us to maybe lean towards thinking about a fundamental substance. And even though there's problems with that, more relational views, they have a lot of appeal, I think, conceptually. But I think that there's like a visceral sort of maybe aversion that I feel, because if you're positing something more like relations as fundamental, I think with the way that we tend to think about things, if you're describing things as traditionally kind of perceived as sort of the substance of relations, or sorry, not the substance, but the sum total of relations, in their environment or something along those lines, the next question that seems to pop up is, okay, like, but what's doing the relating? And so then here, I think you bump into something, maybe like the more, I guess it would be conscient idea of like a thing in itself. Does Whitehead, and then obviously I'm not saying that you follow Whitehead's thinking, all of these things. What is your perspective on the concept of things? Do you believe that there are things in themselves? And if not, I think maybe you can see where that's really counterintuitive to a lot of people. So how do you sort of navigate that, and maybe make the case for sort of the switch in thinking that is required to tackle sort of like a relation first view? Hopefully all that made sense.
No, it does. I appreciate the invitation into this inquiry. I had a conversation with Bernardo Castro a couple of years ago, and after 3 hours, we were really drilling down into this issue because he's like, "Well, how could it be all relations? What's relating?" I mean,
Yeah.
Whitehead has an answer to that, but it's it's an answer that comes in the form of some neologisms like concrescence and actual
Mm.
occasion and so on. And you really have to put in the work to understand what that language means for it to be convincing. And so, in the midst of an argument with someone who's arguing for some kind of substance ontology, it doesn't often come across as convincing, right?
Mm.
But substance ontology has had thousands of years to develop its basic mode of thought, and it's more or less common sense. And Whitehead admits that. We think about things like he uses the example of the gray stone. Uh, the grayness is the property qualifying the substance, which is the matter of the stone. Um, Perfectly ordinary and adequate way of thinking about the world for our usual purposes. But when you bring in what physics has discovered, and when you really examine the texture of your experience at the level of its moment by moment uh, unfolding, you discover, Whitehead would say, no thinker thinks twice. We're new in each moment. Every relationship we enter
Mm.
into with another person or with an environment changes us forever. And we tell stories about how, yeah, this is me and I did that thing back then, but I'm sorry because that wasn't really my intention. So we're always sort of like hedging. It's like, yes, I did that, but now I'm different. I wouldn't do it again. And so, what am I? Am I a fixed substance? Well, I'm a lot different than I was when I was an infant. I don't look anything like that. I couldn't even talk back then. I had no real ideas in my head yet. Um, and so we grow, we develop, we change over the course of a life. And so when you really look at the whole history of your own biography, it's not that like an Aristotelian substance thinker couldn't give an account of that, but Aristotle's substances were way more, we talked about this offline, way more dynamic. A substance for Aristotle is it's a process that unfolds purposefully over the course of a developmental sequence. So an acorn becoming an oak, a fetus becoming an adult human being, right? Um, and so a substantial form in Aristotle's sense is pretty processual in a sense. Um, it's more fixed and rigid than what a Whiteheadian would be happy with. Aristotle doesn't have much room for evolution and variation and our modern understanding of biology, but nonetheless, he got development, or what we would call ontogeny. He described that pretty well. And it's really Aristotle's philosophy of biology is a philosophy of ontogeny, or the development of individual organisms from the seed form to the fully developed form, right? So he would call it an entelechy, a sort of purposeful growth from a potential state to an actualized state. Whitehead's drawing a lot on that basic schema. He's just updating it and making it more relational, because by the time substance thinking gets to Descartes, it gets a lot more abstract. And rather than biology being the model as it was for Aristotle, physics is the model for Descartes. And so he's thinking more in terms of fixed forms that geometry can assess and measure and calculate, rather than the very fluid changing forms of the living world. And substance we could define just as that which requires nothing but itself in order to exist. In other words, that which exists outside of relationship. If there could be such a thing, we couldn't know anything about it. All we can know is how we can relate to things.
Mm.
Right? And so this relational philosophy, Whitehead would argue, is more rooted in our experience, because what's beyond experience is unknown. So we may as well stick with what we do experience. And in the context of experience, relationality is irreducible. The most concrete things, if we're going to talk in terms of things, are relations. And what is relating to what? Well, Whitehead does have an account of concrescence and the emergence of an actual entity or an actual occasion, to put it into more processual language, where what we think of as a subject, which is like the center of experience, actually emerges out of its relations to achieve a unique perspective based on the past relations that it's emerging out of. And as soon as it achieves that unique perspective, Whitehead says it achieves satisfaction. And then that subject perishes. And it becomes part of the data for the next concrescence, which emerges from the world to achieve a new subjective perspective that includes the last one and all the prior ones. So the subject-object relation, it's simplified, but in Descartes, mind and matter, subject and object, are treated more spatially. Whitehead's trying to put it into motion, put it into process, and show, there's a line I'll quote, you brought up Kant. Whitehead says, for Kant, the world emerges from the subject, right? The world is an appearance organized by the structure of our understanding and our sensation. And so we provide the categories in terms of which the world appears to us for Kant. The subject's there already. We organize sensory experience to create the appearance of an objective world. That's Kant's position. So for Kant, the world emerges from the subject. For the philosophy of organism, Whitehead's philosophy, the subject emerges from the world, a superject rather than a subject. Superject was one of his other neologisms. So it's the idea of that which is undergoing the relations being itself a product of a convergence of relations, right? And it's initially a counterintuitive way of thinking. But when you look again at your experience in light of these new categories that Whitehead's developing, I think more is elucidated. Now, I see there's some comments here, in the chat from Nathan about, how do you know that Whitehead's views are accurately describing the nature of reality and the nature of experience? And the problem with that framing of a question is, what's given in experience depends on what kind of questions you're bringing to that experience. There is nothing given. Depends on your framework, depends on the sorts of categories you're using to interpret your experience. And there's a chicken and an egg problem here. I get it, but there's no way out of that chicken and egg problem. And so rather than say, okay, we have this philosophical scheme over here with all these fancy words, and then we have experience over here, and let's compare, these categories to the givenness of experience over here. The problem is there aren't two separate domains like that. We're already awash in experience and our thinking, all of our concepts, part of that experience, And so it would be nice if we only had to compare theories against a world out there that's given the same for all of us. But the givenness of the world is itself up for grabs and needs to be questioned because it's theory dependent, theory relative, right? How you look determines what you see, which is another way of talking about what makes the quantum measurement problem so tricky. I'm not one of those people that says the moon's not there when you're not looking.
Yeah.
But, it's still a tricky issue.
So, sorry, I got distracted by the chat for a second. I think something that emerges for sort of, I don't even want to say other forms of panpsychism, but since what you're describing is in the ballpark of that, it really is this question of interiority, and that's something that I would like to press on a little bit, because when I've talked to either my panpsychist friends or one of my friends who's a really big Whitehead fan, if I come from, I don't even want to say a physicalist perspective because I don't really consider myself a physicalist either, but I think when you look, and maybe this can bridge into some discussion about sort of the metaphysical conversation a little more broadly put, and sort of how people arrive at the conversation. Because if you're coming from the perspective of sort of a more like old school materialism, I think growing up, at least for me, like I said, I'm 41 now. the way that you would hear people talk, and you still sort of see this type of language as well, is of this very like kind of a cold dead universe, like stuff that just kind of trends almost very nihilistic in tone. Of there's no real meaning. It's just little billiard balls kind of bouncing around. This very just completely bereft of any sort of like like the absolute opposite of like vitalism or something along those lines, where it's just been completely stripped of linguistically, at least it's been like completely stripped of like any sort of tone at all of activity, and not even activity, but I think the place where I'm able to get on board with some of the more panpsychist views is to the point where it's sort of making the point that talking about the universe like it's dead. And to be clear, I don't think that even all physicalists do this anymore. Using a word like dead and cold dead, these kind of terms, I mean, they're not particularly helpful, I don't think. Um, and I think that there's a place to stand with some of these views, like panpsychism, where I can definitely go so far as to say that putting sort of a putting sort of a primacy on the fact that like as far as we're able to sort of peer down into, whether it be through quantum physics and things like this, using the word dead doesn't make any sense at all. Because if you're thinking dead, first of all, dead implies that was once alive, or being compared
Exactly.
against life. Yeah, being
Yeah.
compared against life, which even if you get into a concept kind of like a lifeline, even that between like things that are living and things that are not what we would typically refer to as living, that even gets dicey, because then you start talking about viruses and other things like this. So if by consciousness or agentialism, or because that one I'm a little more sympathetic to, um we simply are kind of referring to the fact that like at the, if we want to say, smallest layers of things, there is still this tendency or this ability to interact to the environment. And I think when we were talking yesterday, and to be clear, when I use the analogy of a dead blow hammer, I'm not I understand how dead blow hammers work. I'm not implying that dead blow hammers like somehow defy the laws of physics. But I'm more using it as a metaphor, because we talk about things like cause and effect, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier about, I think it was Hume, in terms of like two billiard balls hitting each other. Um we talk about cause and effect, but it's this sort of more of a why question about how things work the way they seem to appear. I use the example of a dead blow hammer because in principle, conceptually, it seems to not be just necessarily the case that when, say, one thing hits another, that anything happens. So if anyone's ever seen a dead blow hammer, if you take a normal hammer and, say, hit a piece of metal with it, it's going to rebound off of it. But because of the way a dead blow hammer is designed, there's like a second weight inside that essentially, after the first impact happens, there's another weight inside that shifts forward and essentially cancels out the bounce, the rebound. And so, and I mean this purely conceptually, if you just think about, okay, atoms or anything else, anything hitting another thing, it's not logically necessary that anything would happen. And so, as a part of a sort of a fabric of the way things work, the fact that anything happens at all obviously means something. Now, when we go into sort of our model, we say, well, energy is transferred, and some of it, some of that, energy, what is it? Is it the second law of energy can't be created or destroyed? So equal and opposite reaction. Yeah, all of this.
Yeah.
It's like, well, then that, sort of begs the question, okay, what's energy? And then that gets a little, that starts to get, a little vacuous. And so for me, if I'm sort of being as charitable as possible, I do think there is something worth pressing on there, of just the fact that there's that what is occurring can be described as, by its very nature, as being fundamentally active, is important and shouldn't be lost even in more sort of physicalist descriptions of the world. But I think the next jump that I think is difficult for me, and I think is problem from seeing people's discussions, is hard for a lot of people, is this idea of interiority. And it's certainly there in like microconstitutive panpsychism, things like this, and it seems like it's there also in Whitehead's ideas of using words like experience. And I have it sort of formed this way in my notes of, for people to take the fundamental sort of nature of reality as being, active, and maybe even they would be okay saying, like, okay, if you want to call that like aliveness or something like that, maybe that's a pretty easy argument sort of to get people on with. But I think this sort of idea of subjectivity, or if you pull Chalmers, something it is like to be, idea. I feel that just becomes a bridge too far for people. And in a lot of the conversations I've seen, or even participated in with physicalists, that seems to be, the edge of the cliff at which a lot of people balk. The idea that even at the very, very smallest layers of things, or if you want to blow it up as well, like to, something like, because I think then you could talk about anthroposophy and things like that, of that, like, okay, there's definitely something it is like to be the sun or the world, or, the idea that this sort of subjective quality, whatever you wish to call it, interiority, whatever, that this sort of percolates everything. I don't think what I've heard a lot of physicalists say, that's all, it's just complete nonsense. I don't think it's nonsense, and I think that it does work in a sort of a parsimony sense, in that for maybe the more traditional forms of panpsychism, it gives them a pretty pat way to sort of like kind of dodge the hard problem. But can you make more of an argument that isn't sort of simply parsimony based, that some type of interiority or subjectivity like must be kind of ubiquitous, not simply for the sake of parsimony, but as something more like a logical necessity?
I don't know that I could create a solid logical argument, but Whitehead says philosophy is not deduction; it's the search for premises. And so, logical deduction is important. We want to make sure we avoid mistakes in reasoning when we have arrived at some temporary premise that we want to elaborate on. But philosophy is the it's the search for and the exploration of premises, right? Speculative philosophy is. And so when it comes to the question of experience, all I can offer, Whitehead says, look, these are metaphors mutely appealing for an imaginative leap. And choosing a word like experience or feeling, he explicitly doesn't choose consciousness, because some panpsychists just use consciousness to say every particle has an intrinsic nature that's conscious. That, I think, is I don't do that. I think that kind of panpsychist approach just invites the scorn and dismissal of physicalists. But experience, well, most people think is synonymous with consciousness, so maybe it's the same issue. But where you asked about interiority, what makes the relational approach to panpsychism different is that I would not say that experience is the intrinsic nature of an electron, or, I mean, first of all, an electron is an abstract object that we know electricity exists, but electrons, again, it's like any electron is as good as any other electron. They're identical as far as electromagnetism is concerned, the theory is concerned. So whether we're talking about the excitation of a field, instead of a particle. I'm a little hesitant to just say electrons are experiential. They have an intrinsic nature that physics can only describe externally in terms of the mathematical relations. And these things get really tricky. But I don't think of consciousness at the human level or experience at any other level of nature in terms of self-organizing systems as an intrinsic nature. That implies that it's private, that it's locked away from relations. I think what experience is relational, right? Which is to say, let's just think of our own stream of consciousness. What am I experiencing moment by moment? Well, I'm experiencing my own memory and the just past moments that I continue to inherit in the present moment. And so that's one form of relation that's characterizing the texture of my experience. And I'm also experiencing possibilities that I haven't yet experienced in the past. I'm not inheriting, but I am able to imagine what's possible. So Whitehead has these two different kinds of feeling or prehension in his technical terms. Physical prehension of what's already occurred in the past that we inherit moment by moment, and conceptual prehension, which is a feeling of possibilities that haven't yet been part of our past experience. And he thinks you need both to account for the novelty of the universe. There's a lot of repetition, especially in the inorganic world, which is why we can treat atoms and electrons and so on as all identical for the purposes of the physical model. But in the biological world, there's way more conceptual prehension going on in organisms because I hesitate to use the example because I don't like doing violence to animals, of course, but depending on the personality of a dog and its unique history, if you, let's say, instead of kicking a dog, you accidentally step on a dog's tail, some dogs will reach back and bite you. Other dogs will whimper and go hide in the corner. Whereas if you kick a rock, if you know the initial conditions and how much force to apply, you could track exactly how that rock's gonna, with enough computing power and measurement of its initial conditions, again, you can know what's gonna happen. That's because it's rocks and the constituents of rocks are more or less dominated by physical prehensions. In organisms, there's more conceptual prehension, there's more access to novelty. And so all that's to say, the nature of experience is relational. We're never self-enclosed, isolated Cartesian minds, locked in the Cartesian theater, only perceiving a representation of the outside world, like a hallucination or something. And so the relational view is really a shift, and it's difficult because instead of having a foundation we can rest on, an entity that has experience, it's stirring everything into motion, and it makes reality feel more like a fountain. It doesn't have a foundation. It's not that it's turtles all the way down. It's that it's process and relationship all the way down and all the way up. It's perspectives on perspectives on perspectives on perspectives. And yeah, we seek out solid ground because we're earthlings that walk on the surface because of mass and gravity. But maybe that habitual way of thinking is too terrestrial for metaphysics. Maybe we need to think beyond what we're used to. And speculative philosophy is trying to get us to notice all the things that are so general, so generic about the texture of experience, so we don't notice them. We notice what changes, we notice what's different. And we have these habit-bound modes of thought, and philosophy's job is to shake things up, get us out of our parochial, local perspectives so we can actually take a cosmic perspective. And what does experience look like when we're shaken out of these comforting habits of thought?
Yeah. Do you get frustrated with sort of the language problem? Because we've been talking about Whitehead, and he has all these I guess neologisms, these terms, and I've noticed in my sort of relatively short time, in philosophical circles, that there's a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't that happens, where and I won't even say guilty because I think it just sort of happens, where it's like I'll have these conversations with panpsychists And, we sort of get into the weeds, and for panpsychists, they're typically using the word consciousness, and it's like I'll push it down and push it down and push it down and push it down. Um, and typically the ones I've talked to are, I think they have like sort of more, I guess I would say, kind of sophisticated versions, because I'm aware there are sort of maybe kind of just simpler. I don't know. I'm not trying to be uncharitable to them. There's people that do think that like atoms are conscious in a and maybe in a similar way to us, but I don't. That's not been my experience with most people I've talked about. So for those people, it's like, well, you kind of push down and push down and push down, and you reach a point where you say, okay, that's all well and good, but at this point, you're using the word consciousness in a way that doesn't really map very well to sort of natural language. And to be clear, I think that happens for all of the main monisms. There's different forms. I mean, it can happen in physicalism, depending on sort of, and we can get into that maybe as well, and depending on sort of how actually metaphysical of an assertion the physicalist is making. Because if they are skewing more towards the kind of maybe more old school materialist type of view, they do have a similar question to answer of like, what is physical? What does that mean? And you can make a very similar case where, like, especially if you are paying not acknowledging quantum physics at all, we're like, okay, we're really drilling down here, and it's like, I'm pretty sure when you describe to the average person like a quark and what seems to be going on there, that doesn't really sound much like how people use the word physical.
Right.
And
So
so they
quantum
all,
physics, like I should just say though that the understanding of how quarks relate to form, protons and how an atom emerges out of this activity, it's fundamentally, well, that's the wrong word. There are no foundations, right? But it's relational, right?
Mhm.
It's an atom, a proton is emergent from the relations of quarks. They don't exist independent of each other. It's a fully relational depiction of the physical world. So when you ask, what does it mean to be physical? I think a good answer is, well, it means it's part of a system of relationships. That's a much better answer than say what Massimo Pigliucci, the philosopher of biology, said to me the other day, that physical is whatever physics says it is. Well, okay, physics says it is relational, I would say. So let's start there. But
Yeah.
anyways,
Well, I
didn't mean to
think
interrupt.
no, you're good. And so it's like you end up, I think, and to me, it sort of implies, and maybe it ends up pumping into the Munchausen's trilemma thing as well, where it implies that like when we're talking about metaphysics, we are we're sort of asking our language to do something that it really wasn't built to do. And so maybe the only real options on the table are to take existing concepts and sort of try to stretch them. But then you have to make the case to people why it's appropriate for you to stretch them. And I think there are legitimate sort of counters and things that happen there, because like some of the conversations I've seen, I'll be interviewing Tommy Blanchard next week, and he's on the neuroscience side of things. And I kind of get, and he's a physicalist, but I kind of get there where he's like, look, like a lot sometimes panpsychists, they're sort of throwing around this word consciousness, and he's like, well, yeah, maybe it's not exhaustive, but we actually have, and I'm not trying to. This is off the top of my head, so Tommy, if you see this or anything, forgive me if I misrepresent your thinking. I'll double check with him next week, but like it's like, well, hey, we're like, this is kind of my bread and butter over here, that and you're kind of being really loose with this word, and I kind of need that word to not sort of bloat in definition to the point where it loses utility in these other domains. And I think there's maybe something to that, but then it seems like the other alternative is to do what Whitehead did, which is to be like, okay, I'll make up my own word. But then you have another problem because of languages for communication, essentially, of like, okay, no one knows what that means. When you say prehension, you know, people think apprehension. It's not quite the same, and now you have to explain that. So the thing that really kills me, I think, with especially between a lot of the arguments that happen between the different monisms, is it's like, okay, you all are monistic. Um, you know, how much of this disagreement is truly a sort of fundamental disagreement about what's actually occurring, and how much of it is a disagreement about like how are we going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, and I'm curious because I know you obviously do, given the position you hold, you do have probably decent amount of interaction with physicalists. I've tried to be, I don't always succeed, but I try to be as charitable to different views as I can be. It seems to me lately, like I feel like a lot of physicalists, they sort of end up in the metaphysical conversation kind of through a different door. And to be frank, in the worst case scenarios, it's sort of like there's a party going on, and all of a sudden, like the physicalist kind of staggers through the door, fucking drunk, and it's and it's like, are they talking about physics? It's like, well, no, it's actually metaphysics, and then they just like start calling everyone a moron. Um, and a similar thing, not to derail, but like I'm always looking for patterns, and like a similar thing happens in meta ethics. I feel where like there's a lot of really delightful moral realists, but there's also a type of moral realist that like staggers through the door drunk essentially and is like, we're talking about ethics, and it's like, well, we're talking about meta ethics, and then they start like talking about torturing puppies and shit, and then everything goes to hell. So like, but at the same time, I do think that I'll use Anil Seth as an example, because Anil has I feel like a lot of physicalists, they sort of show up to the conversation, and it's not that they have some strong metaphysical sort of assertion. It's almost like they show up with this what I would call like a metaphysical conservatism. Where when you hear Anil, I know he used to call it, he might have shifted the name a little bit, but he used to call it like pragmatic materialism, which, as he described it, was this just sort of very this very sort of ground up view where he's like, you know what? Because I mean, I think the last time I heard him describe it, he was talking to Philip Goff. He was like, maybe what Philip's saying is true, but I just think that, sort of this system that we've been using um, has really served us well. And he uses the example, I think, of like, not that we know like the origin of life, but like in terms of like sort of describing, what life was. It used to be this very mysterious type of a thing. And he makes the case that like we have a much better grasp now on sort of what's going on with living organisms based on our increasing like knowledge of chemistry. And so his position seems to be something more like, I'm just not going to I'm really just kind of not going to say. And it ends up being almost like a faith in future science sort of position. And you'll have to correct me. I can't remember if it was it William James, sort of this idea of like, if you're not able to show something empirically, then you just shouldn't bother talking about it, and it can lead to a real dismissiveness of like, oh, it's just a real, if you can't show me exactly, then it's a complete waste of time and you shouldn't talk about it.
It's like
Which
the
can,
logical positivist position, more or less.
like, it's not just like, oh, well, I don't want to talk. It's like, you shouldn't either. Shut up. Which I think
James would say, I mean, William James's position is a little bit different, like in terms of say like something like the afterlife, because I mean he did a lot of research on mystical experience, religious experience, and he would say, look, we're never going to have empirical evidence one way or the other about the afterlife, but nonetheless, as human beings, we have to decide what type of relationship we're going to have to death, our own and other people's deaths. And so we're in a position where we can't know, and yet we have to act and form a sense of a virtuous response to that unknown, to that limit of our empirical capacity to assess what's the case about death, after death, the afterlife, and so on. And so James's pragmatism is a little bit more like, we accept the limits of what we can know, but nonetheless, as human beings, we have to make meaning of our situation. And science isn't the be all end all only way of knowing and assessing things. And it's not like just because a particular approach to neuroscience says that when the brain decays, mind definitely goes away because the brain produces mind. James would say, well, we don't actually know that the brain produces the mind. We have a lot of evidence of correlations. And so you're overstepping your bounds, Mr. Neuroscientist, by telling people
Mm-hmm.
that when they die, it all goes black. We don't
Mm-hmm.
actually know what happens when we die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And science can't tell us,
Yeah.
you know?
And do you think that pushback, because I do think that pushback is necessary. And, I had a little period there where I had so many sort of experiences of seeing this really kind of flippant, nasty dismissiveness sometimes from certain physicalists that I kind of hit this point where I was like, you don't have to, if you don't, I made the analogy. I was like, it's like I can't remember how I compared the other views, but it was like kids at a birthday party, and a lot of times it's like physicalists. It's like the metaphysical birthday party, and the physicalist is that like angry kid that doesn't want to be there, and he's like sitting over in the corner, and he's just like, "This is all stupid," and you're like, "Well, you don't have to be here." Nope, I'm gonna stay. But at the same time, like I said, I want to be charitable because I think that there's an understandable aversion from people, and especially people that are like, scientists by trade and things like this, where um, you do get this adjacent to woo thing. And I've described woo as, you know, as human beings, we deal with mystery um, every day of our lives, just sort of by our, I guess you'd say, like our epistemic position. It's something that's just a part of our lives of having this relationship to mystery. And I don't think that people who are heavily into the sciences, I don't think in any way that most of them deny that. And I think they have their own relationship to it. And I think that the natural aversion to what people call woo is that I've said it in a way that like um woo is essentially like the fetishization of mystery. And
Mhm.
I think that there's a relevant point to be made that like if you start to sort of fetishize mystery, you can actually gain an aversion to trying to have a better understanding of things. And I think that there is an understandable pushback from people in the scientists or in the sciences, and not that all scientists are physicalists, but I think a really good proportion of them sort of land there. Um, I'm a big fan of trying to hit sort of a middle path. How do you how do you sort of navigate that for yourself? And as I said earlier, that is something I like about Whitehead, is I feel like, it's a big swing, but it's trying to sort of honor all of these different things. How do you navigate that for yourself of being open to mystery, whether it's for something like spirituality, art, all these different kind of things? How do you navigate trying to maintain full openness to the experience and the very like lived experience and how beautiful that can be of sort of arraying yourself before mystery? And I think that that can even touch on certain kind of religious ideas like obeisance and awe and wonder and maybe even worship in certain contexts. How do we sort of, if we're trying to have a very sort of complete view, or maybe something like Whitehead was trying to accomplish, how do we split that balance of understanding the utility of science, of not sort of overstepping our bounds, and resisting further inquiry, you know, giving all these tools, whether it be logic, reason, science, giving them their due and their proper place, but also not getting trapped by that side of things of like hyper reductiveness, where people can end up, I think, in what is a very sort of impoverished existence.
Mhm.
If that
Yeah.
makes sense. Like, how do you sort of
Yeah.
see sort of splitting that difference?
Well, I'll start by quoting the end of Whitehead's final book, Modes of Thought, where he addresses this quite directly. He says, if you like to phrase it so, philosophy is mystical, for mysticism is direct insight into depths as yet unspoken. But the purpose of philosophy is to rationalize mysticism, not by explaining it away, but by the introduction of novel verbal characterizations rationally coordinated, inventing new words. Philosophy is akin to poetry. and both of them seek to express that ultimate good sense which we term civilization. In each case, there is reference to form beyond the direct meanings of words. Poetry allies itself to meter, philosophy to mathematic pattern. So, that's how Whitehead viewed that, which he also, he had this fallacy, the fallacy of the perfect dictionary, which is the idea that, look, we already have all the terms we need to define reality adequately. We don't need to invent new ones. And I think for Whitehead, language is not primarily representational, which is to say, this simple idea that we learn by pointing at objects and then giving the name for the thing we're pointing at. It's like not that's downstream of the beginnings of what learning language is really about. And I don't even think language is just about communication. Like I have some thoughts that I need to translate into words to then send through the air, through the electronics into your ears that you then decode back into thoughts. That's a representational view of language, right? That there's the thought, there's a language of thought before it gets into the English words that we use to share publicly what we mean. I think that's a forced understanding of language. I think language can be more or less representational, and science needs it to be in order to, come up with. Science invents new jargon all the time. You look into specialized journals. But the basis of language, I think, is more expressive. When we speak, rather than it being representational, I think it's primarily transformational, which is to say, just like poetry's not trying to describe something out there. It's trying to transform our experience, right? And so we engage in linguistic expression in order to change what we thought was given in experience. Language alters perception. Language doesn't just describe what we perceive. And so when you recognize, I think that is more, there's a whole school of thought that comes out of the Romantic era called expressivism, which views language this way. That, in other words, we don't even know what we think until we say it. And so that's why language isn't initially communicative. It's not initially about communication. It's about understanding what we ourselves what we even think before we try to communicate it. And not that there isn't a communicative basis later that we can achieve through linguistic expression, not that we can't approach something like representation of something out there in the world that science wants to designate and hold still so that they can analyze it. But that's not the base of language. And I think philosophy is really, this is why Whitehead says it's akin to poetry. We're trying to engage in a transformational process whereby, we come up with new words and new ways of speaking to illuminate and elucidate those corners and crevices of our experience that had previously been beyond our ability to language, right? And so language is both limiting and also we're always building bridges beyond what we thought could be said. And so that's philosophy's role, I think, is to stretch language and to recognize the ways in which grammar both allows us to, have some ground rules so that we can say things that are meaningful to a large audience of people. But also there's malleability there. And there's something about, Whitehead would say, the subject predicate grammar of, most Indo-European languages that metaphysically leads us to substance property ontology, right? And so he would say, Aristotle's brilliant, but what he's really doing with his metaphysics is working out the grammar of the Greek language. Is the grammar of the Greek language a perfect mirror of the structure of reality? Probably not.
Yeah.
And yet we still have to speak in these terms with subjects and predicates. And so, but Whitehead is saying that, look, we bring consciousness to the structure of our language, we can then not be so literal minded when we nonetheless use language with this grammatical structure to try to get at something that we know can't be that way, right? We want this foundation or a substance underlying our experience because of the fact that predicates have to adhere to subjects in a sentence. But knowing that, we can see why we have that temptation and try to think beyond it.
Yeah. Yeah, I find, because you just said that about Greek, I've found myself wondering that a lot about sort of like, what would they call, like the Anglophone thing, where, I end up in these sort of frustrations and I'm constantly wondering, like, I wonder, that relationship between sort of language and thought really fascinates me because, um, I wonder, especially something that is quite structurally different, like Japanese, or Chinese. Like, I often wonder, I'm like, do they have access to actual forms of conceptualization that I don't? Because so much of literally the structure of my own thought is sort of captured by English, in terms of being a tool set. Um, if you were sort of to think forward, because as I see it right now, I think it can be a bit unpleasant. Um, but I feel like there's, even within science itself, um, I think you sort of need different types of people. I think that you need rule followers. I think you need even maybe like rule enforcers to some degree, but I think you also need rule breakers. You need people that are your kooks, your people that are like, I think Yosha Bach talked about it, and he didn't mean it as a pejorative, but he like, I forget all his categorizations, but like he called them like the crazies, and he referred, I think, to like someone like Stephen Wolfram, that way. Where it's like, and if you look through the history of science, no, it wasn't like some people fall into this trap of thinking about like, oh, science is just this like edifice of like of grouchy dickheads, and they just stick there, and then there's these lone geniuses that every once in a while come across. Like the lone genius thing is a little bit of a myth. Like science only works when it's collaborative. But I think in a broad context, like the system, whether it be sort of philosophy broadly put, or science, or the interaction between science and philosophy, um, it seems like maybe, and I don't want to use a really negative word like doomed, but it seems like we're maybe, I'll just use it because I can't think of a better word, like doomed to have this situation where, just in terms of like personal disposition, we're always going to have people that are very focused in this very like narrow, like when they drift too far, they get really myopic and they get really mustardy and granular, and it's like, not to make it like, I'm not going to make it about politics, but like it's almost a similar thing of this idea of like conservatism, where it's like almost a natural resistance that forms, where it's like, no, like calm down, you over there, you're going too far. We need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. This stuff here works. I'm going to focus on this. I'm going to like hone this. And then you're always going to have, though, these other people out there that are like, you need, and if you want to look at it in a biological standpoint, you need that guy that's like, I'm going to climb over that mountain and discover. You need your people that push. And I think that if you have all of one or the other, you run into problems, because if
Yeah.
everyone's this really narrow, myopic sort of hold the walls type of a thing, then it leads to stagnation. But if everyone's just willy-nilly just running off into the distance, that's not really workable either. So the whole endeavor strikes me as being really fundamentally human. But it does lead to a lot of contentiousness, and maybe that contentiousness is the point, but
Yeah. Heraclitus says war is the father of all things.
yeah,
Strife is the father of all things, right? And listening to you, I'm reminded it's kind of at the core of process philosophy. We're never going to settle these issues.
yeah.
And in the very end of Process and Reality, Whitehead says there is a greatness in the lives of those who build up religious systems, a greatness in action, in idea, and in self-subordination, embodied in instance after instance through centuries of growth. There is greatness in the rebels who destroy such systems. They are the titans who storm heaven armed with passionate sincerity. It may be
Mm,
that the revolt is the mere assertion of youth of its right to its proper brilliance, to that final good of immediate joy. Right? So there's the conservative forces and the progressive forces. And the universe the evolutionary process is always going to involve the conflict of these two impulses: habit and novelty, order and chaos. We exist in the perpetually cresting wave between, in the tension between those, so that is what you would expect to be the case if the universe was a process relational sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that very fulfilling. I'm definitely going to continue reading Whitehead because it's I've been on both sides of the fence because I grew up in like very high control religion. And then I had a really messy breaking free of that. And then I went into the New Age movement for a while, and I was a conspiracy theorist. And I've just kind of, and politically, I've been all over the place. Um, and you get kind of battered up by all of that. But you start to notice sort of patterns after a while. And I think this is where something like charitability and, I like to say, defaulting to compassion is important.
Mhm.
Because I think that we, whether it's physicalists and idealists or, any of these things, I think we very naturally sort of like pull on each other. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm not in any way proposing that, if, like I said, those sort of extremes that I talked about people who can like fall into the trap of myopia. And then there's also people that can fall into a different trap of essentially being like entirely ungrounded. I think that you can, as people, we can sort of accept where we happen to fall, and that can change maybe sometimes. I think I have. You can accept sort of where you fall on that continuum while also having sort of the compassion and the charitability to understand that, like, not everybody needs to be like you know, and just accept that even though you're gonna bump heads with people, that sort of is the project, you know.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, you were talking earlier about monism and panpsychism, like physicalism and idealism are forms of monism, and I think that's a perfectly adequate way of categorizing it. But I think Whitehead actually says he's a pluralist. In other words, he contrasts Spinoza, who's a monist. There's one infinite substance, and thought and extension are just the two attributes of that one infinite substance. And Whitehead contrasts the Spinozist monism to Leibniz, who imagines a cosmos composed of monads, infinitely many monads. And so he's a pluralist in that sense. And Whitehead says he has differences with Leibniz because Leibniz's monads are windowless, which means self-enclosed and not in relationship. Whitehead's actual occasions are almost all relationship. But Whitehead says he's more like Leibniz. He's more of a pluralist, which is to say, Nietzsche in Will to Power talks about, he develops a form of perspectivalism. Like earlier, I was saying, well, what is reality? It's perspective on perspective on perspective without anything besides perspectives, to perceive. And so it's groundless. It's again more like a fountain, constantly giving rise to new perspectives than it is a foundation, something out there that we have perspectives on, right? And so White is more of a pluralist, and I think that lends itself to exactly the type of ethic that you're talking about. Like, you're always going to meet alternative perspectives from your own, and being ethical and virtuous, I would say, is a matter of engaging dialectically, so as to always be in pursuit of a synthetic perspective, where your own becomes enriched by encountering other perspectives, such that a larger, more complex perspective can be brought forth as a result of the relationship that you forge with others, right? That's the name of the game. And sometimes reality is such that one perspective ends up being more powerful, that this is Nietzsche's point, more powerful than another perspective, and eliminates other perspectives. It's, biological evolution is not a peaceful process. And panpsychism is not this Pollyanna, like, wishful thinking that, wouldn't it be wonderful if everything in the universe can feel pain? Everything in the universe can feel pain too. if this is a true vision of reality. And that's tragic as hell. I don't affirm panpsychism because I think it's just a wonderful thing. And wouldn't it be nice if reality was this way? It's fucking terrifying to imagine. But I think it's more realistic. And
Mm.
there's joy too, and there's beauty, and there's tragic beauty even. Whitehead says tragic beauty is the highest form of beauty, of aesthetic intensity. It's the best we
Yeah.
can hope for. And it's you know, the kind of joy that doesn't ignore loss. And so
Mm.
it's more than happiness. It's like a synesthetic experience. It's this enriching emotion that's not happiness, and it's not sadness. It's something, I guess, synthetic. That's not in the sense of fake, but a synthesis that we know is beautiful and meaningful. And so, despite the pain and suffering that a panpsychist universe forces us to face, I think, yeah, at the end of the day, at least there's meaning. And I think we seek meaning, really, as human beings more than we seek happiness.
Mm.
um, I would suggest, but yeah,
Well,
just to say,
we're willing to suffer if we feel like it's for something, you know. And I think that that's
right.
yeah, that's important. And it is, I've written some about religious deconstruction, and as I said, I grew up like fundamental Baptist, this incredibly literalist type of Christianity. I call myself an atheist now. That's mainly in reference to that type of thing. But I've been opening myself up a bit more to looking at sort of the different conceptions of God, and it actually struck me yesterday. I can't remember whether it was as a result. I don't think it was directly referenced in anything I was looking at. But the whole problem of evil idea, that's always brought up, in response to, I guess, maybe these more narrow concepts of God about, well, if God is all good, how could he allow suffering, and I'm not a fan of the he language and all that. I don't like personified ideas of God really at all. But I suddenly kind of realized, I was like, if one wishes to conceive of something like God as a much more sort of immanent, panentheist or pantheist, this more sort of type of thing, it almost struck me that, not in the sense of it being like quote unquote a problem, but like the problem of suffering and evil, and what you just said about panpsychism sort of struck me in the same way, where it kind of goes away, because it's like, and maybe someone could even jump in, and there's a big part of me that is disgusted with myself right now for even saying this, but I got to follow my thinking where it goes, regardless how I feel about it. You could even say that something like the character of Jesus might even represent this, of
Hmm.
saying that, like, the problem of evil isn't so much of a problem if every bit of our suffering is God's suffering, so to speak.
Yeah,
Because
totally,
it's
totally.
not something that's bestowed upon some creation that is separate from itself. Like, because that the problem of evil implies sort of a moral culpability, a moral stance. But if you're looking at God and from the perspective of everything that is and of which we are a part, this more sort of classical, like, in him we live and move and have our being, sort of an idea, there is no suffering that I experience that God, so conceived of, does not also experience. My suffering
Hmm.
is God's suffering. And I think that maps well onto whether you want to call it pan experientialism, or, you know what I mean? Because there isn't
Yep.
this gap. There isn't this gap. There is no accountability for my suffering to anything else, because there is no separation between me and anything else. You know, and it sort of disappears if you lose that separate personified sort of God character, at least in any sort of a literal sense. I understand where um people maybe find sort of like a spiritual utility in some of these concepts, and maybe that's where it all sort of started. Because I find myself wondering as well, even when you look at other religions and things through history, like the Greeks, it's like I think I've made the mistake based on my upbringing and ideas of God of just sort of transposing that over onto other forms of religion, of thinking that like, oh, they're and you see that a lot in sort of the new atheist circles, the type which I came out of. I spent a good bit of time in, of just automatically viewing the concept of God as the default of this very American, very like God the Father, disapproving of all your behaviors and judging you and hell and actually being eternal conscious torment. Like there's just, for like sort of the new atheists, there's this like presumption that that is what, you know, and I think they can be forgiven in a way, because that does exist. And I think that that type of religion needs to be resisted, because I think it leads, we can show that it can lead to really bad things in the world. But I think it's even as someone who calls himself an atheist, I think it's incredibly uncharitable to act like that sort of worst incarnation is the only conception of God that there is. And
Yeah.
even as an atheist, I have like a vested interest in sort of, I think, examining some of these other concepts. And I this is pure wondering. I'm gonna say what the name of the article will be. It's sort of in its, whatever you want to call it, gestation phase. But I'm thinking of working on an article called "The God Aversion," sort of playing
Hmm.
off the Dawkins God delusion idea. Because the more I see people in these conversations, including sort of my fellow atheists and then people that are maybe more involved in sort of the hard sciences and stuff, I wonder, I try not to actively psychologize people, but I really increasingly wonder if much of the way that a lot of us think about these things comes from this sort of deep terror of allowing anything like a God concept to creep back into the picture. And as someone who was massively damaged by high control fundamentalist religion, trust me, like, I fucking get it, because I feel that way a lot myself.
Yeah.
But I just, more and more, I just can't get away from thinking that that's kind of bullshit. That as atheists, I think, oftentimes we are still allowing the structure of our thought to be almost entirely dictated and inhibited by something that we deny. And it pains me to say that, because I don't want to come to that conclusion about myself. But I kind of can't get away from it.
Yeah.
And I really want to press on that more, because maybe we can angle towards drawing this to a close. But I think that this sort of bumps into the metaphysical question in a way, because I think there's this charge of like triviality, I think, that you see come up a lot in these sort of conversations, where someone might say, oh, well, you say you're metaphysically agnostic, but you might take that as a conscious decision, but you have some sort of metaphysical assumption operating at the base of your thinking. The fact that you might not have examined it, maybe, you know, that could be a problem. How do you think about that? Do you think that people can be truly metaphysically agnostic, whether that be for having some sort of pro or against God conception, or do you think that it is truly possible to be metaphysically agnostic? Um, Obviously, you can
I,
claim to be, but
sure. I mean, I think of James again, and how he would relate to something like the question of an afterlife, or the question, does God exist or not? There's no neutral way of raising the question, or answering the question, because each of us has our own unique experiences. Like I wasn't raised um, in an evangelical context, even though my mother was a very committed uh, Christian. She didn't force me to go to church or anything, and I wasn't, there was no kind of spiritual abuse that was done to me as a child. And so, but still, we all have our contexts and our upbringing and of relationship to religion. That's in various traditions. That's either going to be positive or negative or something in between. And we're so deeply shaped in the West by the history of Christianity that you see the structure of apologetics coming through, even in the most fervent atheists like Richard Dawkins, who has a very kind of Calvinist view in how he understands human beings as the only species, apparently, that's able to rebel against its selfish genes. So nature, the biological world, is very sinful. You could, but human beings, we can freely choose to not be that way. We can rebel against that, and so there's a way in which, in his atheism, Dawkins is just reproducing the same theological structure and basis of morality. And in his old age, he's recognizing, oh, I guess I am a cultural Christian after all.
Yeah.
I don't believe, but I can see how I've been shaped and the value of it. But what you've been describing, that like God can suffer, that's process theology. That's what actually kept Whitehead's books in print through most of the 20th century, is that the liberal theologians, Protestant theologians, took up his new idea of God. He would say, Whitehead said, God is a creature of creativity. God is a fellow sufferer who understands. And God is active in the world, not beyond the world, but active in the world as the lure toward intensity of experience. Ingredient in every moment of our experience is this divine lure that says, seek intensity, seek beauty, seek more relationship. And that lure doesn't determine what we decide to do moment by moment, but it's there and we feel it. And when we don't lean into life, we do feel like, I think, naturally a kind of guilt. Like we know when we're not living up to the expectation of what? Of our own higher self, you might say. I mean, it doesn't need to the expectation of God, because God is an immanent, in Whitehead's view, this immanent feeling that he describes God as like a mirror that's held up to each creature to reflect back its own potential greatness. So our feeling of conscience in the ethical domain is an example of that. But an artist is feeling that too, and they complete a work and they're like, well, it's not quite what I was imagining, and they try again. That impulse for Whitehead, that's the divine. And his view of God is not as a ruthless moralist who's judging, sinful from good from bad or evil behavior. It's sometimes this divine impulse can appear in its social context as evil. I mean, Jesus was put to death by his own people. Socrates was put to death by his own people because they're introducing novelty into their societies as a result of an intuition, an inner instinct that, oh, wait, we could do better. But their society's more conservative and says, no, you're wrong, you're bad, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And yet history, given time to reflect on that, says, oh, well, whoops, that was a mistake. And so God as a fellow sufferer, God not as impassive, as totally unaffected by anything that happens in the world. From Whitehead's point of view, that's not a functional religious view. And all that it does is create alienated, angry, judgmental human beings. So he's offering this new theology that I think is, I think he's got tremendous relevance to natural science, but I also think as someone for whom religion and religious experience is just an inescapable part of human life, I think he has a lot to teach us about how to do that in a way that's not so prone to dogmatism and to othering and judgmental types of behavior. I'm an atheist when it comes to most images of God. I don't believe in many types of God, but I do think that there's something attractive about Whitehead's way of bringing God back into polite conversation. And maybe not always polite. I mean, sometimes this divine lure leads us to do things that, again, like disturb the settled habits of our social setting, and that is initially going to be quite upsetting, but in the longer run, you can see, well, that was an important creative breakthrough. Um,
And it
so
might,
yeah, I appreciate everything you were saying. It's an important reframing.
yeah.
Even if you're an atheist, I think it allows you to respect the religious impulse and just to see how hard that is to really escape. There is no neutrality in these questions.
Mm.
You know, like Richard Dawkins would say, all children are born atheists. Have you talked to many children about what they think? Because I don't think that's true. I'm not saying
Yeah.
they're born Christian or Jewish or whatever,
No.
but they're not born atheists. That's not a neutral, atheism's
Yeah.
not the neutral position,
Mm.
you know? So,
Yeah. I think it, one of the things that did strike me as well was within what I was reading of Whitehead of actually putting some real importance on things like aesthetics, and that's something that I've found quite interesting because even in some of the reading and listening to certain people in sort of fundamental physics, Lawrence Krauss, all these different people, it's something you see. Mathematicians talk about where it's like, yeah, the sort of the, and I'm not a math person, but like sort of the formulas that oftentimes, I mean, of course they ultimately they need to be proven out and stuff, but there's like this acceptance, it seems, in mathematics that um the things that get the most attention are what tend to strike the mathematicians as beautiful or aesthetic. You know, there is a role of aesthetics even in things like mathematics. There is it does almost seem, even in that aspect, it's like an inescapable. And it doesn't seem like it is just purely subjective. I think things like the golden mean, things like that, people can sometimes get a little carried away in how far they extrapolate from that. But also to deny and to try to make a sort of a counter assertion that something like the golden mean showing up all throughout nature, that's just completely weird happenstance. Like, I think to sort of draw it to a summation, it's like, yeah, I mean, compare against the type of religious views that I grew up around. Maybe I'm an atheist, but it doesn't kill you to admit the mystery and admit that, like, there's very likely things about our experience and our lives that we might never expect science to be like fit for task to fully describe, and that's okay. I don't think that it ever was supposed to do that, you
yeah,
know? Like
yeah,
having a little bit more of an ability to just like pull a Newton and say hypothesis non fingo, like it's okay. You know what I mean? And what you want to call doing that, you can call it whatever you want. Like I wrote an article about atheist spirituality, and it's like it's sort of a liberating thing. It's like I've talked to certain atheists where they get the substance of what I'm talking about, but they're like, I can't get on board with this spirituality word. It's like that's fine. You know, for me, it's a
mhm,
similar thing with the word God. Like I'm increasingly able to talk about it a bit more, but when I say the word God, it just lands in my brain with both boots. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Um, because of my
yeah,
background, because we have associations with certain words. But I think I'm reaching more of a point of kind of liberation where I'm like, I don't have to like bully myself into back wanting to use that word. But if at root, if we can just sort of relax and really like liberate ourselves to be able to embrace the beauty and the mystery, and also science and things can be a part of that. Science is
yeah,
an amazing tool for navigating that mystery, to learning more about the world. It shouldn't be about, granted, to make progress you need to sort of like plant flags in the sand as you go, to kind of like keep
yeah,
track of where you've been and where you're going. But I think everyone just needs to fucking relax a little bit. Fucking relax
yeah,
a little bit, and just open yourself up to being able to like embrace really, I think is a good word, to embrace life in all of its
yeah,
different manifestations, including science. And if religion or spirituality, if you live your life and you're like, you know what, I get full experience of the mysterious and yada through science and these other things, that's totally fine, you know. But maybe don't be a dickhead to other people who decide to do it differently.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had a conversation with the intelligent design theorist Stephen Meyer a couple weeks ago, and I think intelligent design is not just bad science. I think it's bad theology.
Yeah.
And so while I think that science and religion can find a better way of being in dialogue and that there's no necessary conflict between science and religion, I also think it's important that they both stay in their lane. And one of the issues with in the modern period, because I think in the medieval period, say what you will about the church, I'm not really in the interest, I don't have any interest in defending the Catholic Church as a whole, but it was the biggest supporter of what was thought of as science through the whole Middle Ages. And if without the church and scholasticism, there wouldn't be a Descartes and a Newton and a Galileo. As much as in the 17th century, there were some conflicts that arose. That's the shift in the modern period where science increasingly started to feel like it could answer religious questions, and religions started to think that they had to compete with science and explaining
Mm,
nature. And it's like, no, 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 no. We can stay in our lanes and coexist peacefully. I love this line. Galileo quotes someone else, but he puts it in his book. He says, "Science tells you how the heavens go, and religion tells you how to go to heaven." It's a cute little way of thinking about it. But I think Whitehead has a different way. In the beginning of Process and Reality, he says, "Science is the study of what we are aware of in perception, the patterns that show up in perception, and science tries to systematize the relationships of those patterns. Religion has to do with our emotional response to those perceptions and the desire to transform our character as a result of, how we hold and shape that emotional response, right? And you can do a science of religious experience, where again you're studying the patterns of that emotional response. But religion's saying no, but you are involved. You are, in a sense, that emotional response to your experiences. And so religions form around our attempts to transform character as a result of attending to those emotional responses, right? So science can study perception, religion can find ways of transforming our emotional response to perception to shape character, and we can all get along, you know? And of course, as we were talking about earlier, reality is such that conflicts of various kinds are always going to emerge. But I think science and religion are both important parts of being a full human being. And maybe we don't
yeah.
need to call it religion,
Hmm.
call it whatever you want. It's how you handle uh, how you deal with your emotions is just one way of putting it. You can
Mm,
say, well, that's psychology, but I don't mean other people's emotions. I don't mean emotion in general. I mean you.
mm,
How do you deal with, anger and aggression and depression, sadness and loss? Like, we have religions because life is suffering, and science can help alleviate suffering, and it can create a hell of a lot of more suffering when its knowledge is applied in ways without any grounding in the sort of ethical and moral formation that religions typically care about, right? So we need both of these, and I know words can be triggering, religion, God, whatever. I'm not attached to particular words. It's just, well, what are we talking about?
yeah.
We don't have a perfect dictionary. Come up with whatever word
Hmm.
works for you, but these functions of human life need to be addressed.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, and this is the thing. I think it harkens to what you were saying earlier, like the pluralism thing. I think it's just like more and more. And this doesn't mean that I can't have, well, like you said with the intelligent design thing. This doesn't mean I can't have an actual like substantive disagreement with a view. So I'm not doing some sort of wishy-washy, everyone's right, no, like no, I mean I can have strong disagreements, but more and more I'm not out here like identity shopping, when it comes to studying different forms of different philosophical views or metaphysical views. It's like typically man, I can't remember who said it. Um there's a quote, somebody might be able to remember, but there's a quote that essentially says we share the truth between us. Now, this doesn't mean that it's 50-50. That doesn't mean when you and I are talking, there's some really, what colloquially we would call horrible people out there, where if I talk to them, they probably might only have a 2% nugget of, truth maybe in the bottom of what they're saying. But having that as your attitude of we share the truth between us, of saying, what, as you were saying, it's like whether it's religion, science, all these different things. as the creatures that we are, all of these are different systems that we have to help us to navigate the situation in which we find ourselves.
Yeah.
And there are different, I know people like Dawkins, hate the Noma thing, but I think there's a nugget of truth to the non-overlapping magisteria thing, where it's like, do they sometimes overlap? Like, yeah, that's somewhat the point of like, one of the first articles that I wrote, and I don't even know as I'm 100% agree with myself at this point. Um, One of the first articles I wrote though was saying that like there's a nugget of truth, I think, to the Noma idea of saying, we don't need to completely get rid of these things. We just need to be aware of what they're good for and what they're not good for. And so at the time, my thing essentially was I was so hubristic as to call it a razor, which was that like if something can be like essentially ceded to science, then you cede it to science. And then of course I had some people be like, well, not everything can be ceded to science. And I'm like, yeah, that's literally
What
then
I
don't
just said.
seed it. That's what I
Yeah.
just said.
Yeah.
And it's a razor. It's not supposed to be necessarily a true in every single circumstance. But I think I still overall kind of vibe with that, where it's like, what, if it's something that falls within the domain of science, then yeah, cool, seed it to science. But once again, that doesn't mean that science unto itself will necessarily be able to exhaust the conversation about it.
Mhm.
All of these things are different frameworks, and as you said with synthetics or syncretics, like I've just found, and this is just self-report, but I've just found such immense value, and based on the way I think, I love being a generalist. I love looking at all these different views, and that's what kills me, I think, when it comes to a lot of these metaphysics conversations. And I think you mentioned it, and maybe we can sort of then wrap up. And you mentioned, because I watched your conversation with Keith Frankish, and at face value, look at your view, look at his. You're like, man, these guys are not going to probably have anything in common. And then when you really kind of drill down on it, you're like, well, obviously we don't agree across the board. We're not saying the same thing. But holy shit, like he's kind of landing at a somewhat similar conclusion, coming, like I said, somewhat with the physicalist thing. He's kind of walking through a different door. But we're kind of going like, yeah, you're right. I don't, in that instance, like, I don't really think there is something to this qualia idea, you know? Like, and I see these just general human interactions as just being sort of this web, you know, this network where we're all sort of pinging down these different lines, and someone might be on the other side of the web, and then we converse, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, wait a minute, we have this conjunction point. And
Yeah.
to me, like, that's the fucking sauce, you know? Like, if
Yeah.
I think a disagreement is important enough that I have to kind of go hammer and tongs with somebody a bit, I'll do it. But at my age now, and not that I'm like old, but at my age now, and having spent years, and I have my debate bro period, I just don't fucking care anymore. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, what am I
Mhm.
doing? Like, what is debate bro bullshit? It's like, I'm not saying it has no place. I think debate does have, like, formal debate has a place. I want to understand how you think. I'm not here to be like, oh, do I agree or disagree with Matt? What could be more fucking boring than whether or not I disagree? Who gives a shit? Like, that doesn't mean I don't have
Yeah.
that doesn't mean
Yeah.
I don't have an opinion. But seriously, who gives a fuck? And this
Yeah.
comes back to this idea of a very active, like a focus on an active, a developing, a learning attitude towards interacting with other people. I am hideously wrong about things so often, and this has been my main lesson I've learned. And I think you might have commented. That might have been when we first maybe even started to kind of talk more. Was the article I wrote about I was wrong about illusionism, and you probably are too. I'm not an illusionist, and as I predicted in the article, there are people that are like, oh, well, illusionism. I'm like, I'm not arguing for illusionism. Like, that, you're missing the whole point. The point is, I saw this sort of face value. Here's what illusionists think. Typically, hearing the description from people who weren't illusionists, and I'm like, well, that's dumb and self-defeating.
Yeah.
Stupid, you know. And then when you get in there, it's not about suddenly being like, oh, well, I'm an illusionist now. It's not that. But when you realize, when you talk to people in good faith and realize what they're actually saying, you're like, oh, well, yeah, I don't think the same thing because I'm not a physicalist, and typically illusionists are physicalists. But I actually, first of all, I actually came to understand what they were saying for its under its own lights, and I actually gained a respect for it because I'm like, look, I'm not a physicalist, and I do ultimately not really agree with illusionism, but I have respect for illusionism because there's a way in which I think it's very brave because it actually like sort of bites the bullet and takes sort of the physicalist line of thought kind of to its
Mhm.
logical conclusion in some ways.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I
I
have
always say eliminative
yep.
materialism is a more consistent form of materialism, which is it's related to illusionism. But like, yeah, with Keith Frankish, we both realized and agreed that, well, I would say what the illusionist helps us understand is that what this concept of qualia as an attempt to account for what experience essentially is, it leads the panpsychist and the dualist to adopt it in down a very I would say ultimately incoherent path, right?
Yep.
And so qualia would be another way of getting at the intrinsic nature argument that I was saying earlier. I find problematic. It's not qualia would be the opposite of a relational count of experience. It's totally
Yep.
incommunicable in private. Your
Yep.
qualia. It's like, well, okay, I can't do much with that concept of experience, you
Mm,
know. And
yep.
so Keith and I really we share an enemy. What better way to bring people together?
Yeah. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's the thing though too. That's the thing though too, I would say is like illusionism wasn't for me, but if I had just rejected, which I did initially, and then I realized I was full of shit. Um, if I had just rejected the whole thing out of hand and been like, ah, that's stupid. Well, I didn't end up being an illusionist, but then learning about, I had a conversation with a guy who writes here named Tower of Babel, and I actually got to better grips with it. I didn't end up agreeing with it, but it was through that I then learned about Pete Bandick's paper on qualia quietism, which ended up actually being much closer, I think, to I was like, okay, I actually think is quite compelling. Like,
Yeah.
I don't believe that he created the concept, but his paper on quietism, I was like, okay, this I think is actually matches how I actually think about it. I wouldn't have even learned about that and seen a defense of that because so that's another point to make. Just examining other views. What are you scared of? You know what I mean? If something's so dumb and so stupid and so obviously self-defeating, then it shouldn't hurt you to actually grapple with it at face value. And either you learn something or you learn that you were correct. But even if you learn that your initial impression was mostly correct, you don't know in the process of inquiry what else you're going to discover. And so this very flippant, reflexive dismissiveness that I've been guilty of, I see other people in philosophy be guilty of all the time. These appeals to their own intuition. Well, that's just obviously false. Okay, waiting for an argument that doesn't mean anything. You know, then this comes back to that principle of charity. Like, we're all trying to really, where we should be, I think, we're all really trying to do the same thing here. And if we're not able to engage in open dialogue, if we're not able to um, deal with what other people are actually saying and not what it's more convenient for us and our little views to think that they're saying, then what are we even doing here? You know, what's the point?
Yeah.
If we're not in some way contributing toward not just the furthering of our own thinking, but the furthering of our own thoughts or thought or human thought in general,
Yeah.
then what sort of
Yeah.
myopic, I mean, that is nihilistic. What sort of myopic, narrow endeavor are we engaged in?
I think evolution, biological, cosmological evolution is ultimately it's a learning process. And so at the human scale, I always much prefer and seek actively dialogue and to allow for new perspectives to enter into the perspective that I've been carrying and building so that the truth can exist between us and that we can coordinate these perspectives not around some independent reality because it's perspectives all the way down, but so that we can intensify and enhance the texture of our experience and together move towards some future ideal where as a regulative principle that helps guide our judgment and our interactions now, where we think, okay, well, we could increase our knowledge and understanding if we can work together dialogically. And debate, in contrast, doesn't do that. You come into an interaction with your view and you're going to defend it because you think you're already right. You have nothing to learn from the other person. The only reason I would ever watch a debate, I mean, they can be entertaining, but or engage in a debate is because the audience might have the opportunity to integrate and achieve a higher perspective than when they started. But if it's
Let's,
clear, that
I,
the other opponent is not going to change their view, I have to think about the audience instead.
yeah, yeah. And I think that yeah, I think for actual formal debate, like I said, I don't think it's wrong. I think that I think that formal debate like is for the audience, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
And so like if you I think that the rules are definitely different because if someone is entering a debate, it's like, well, you are defending this position. And in a lot of ways, it's like you are then the servant of the position, so that people can actually see what the position entails. You're not necessarily like the servant of, I guess you'd say, very loosely using this term, but you're not really the servant of truth or like a search for truth. You are a servant to be
yeah,
like, let everyone in the audience see what does this position say and how does it interact with this other position. So it's not
yeah,
really it's not
yeah,
about you, but it's also not about, and I think that's the problem when you get into sort of debate bro culture is it's not about the audience, but it's also not about us. It's not about a search for truth. It's literally just a pure act of ego, essentially,
yeah. And it's
because you
not,
start doing these moves to win instead
right.
of,
Yeah. And there, I mean, there's the risk of audience capture and whatnot. That's a huge issue. Um, but I think I approach this pedagogically. Um, Again, it's about learning. And I seek interlocutors who don't agree with me, who have interesting disagreements with me that allow me to, again, expand my own perspective. And often online, you'll encounter people that disagree with you, and sometimes I'll engage a little bit. And then I discover in an attempt to explain my view that either they're not getting it or they continue to misrepresent my view and are arguing against a position that I don't hold. And so, in cases like that, I just kind of like, well, this encounter failed, so I'm just going to move on.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I engage in public philosophy because I want to generate interesting disagreements, you know. And we would hope in academia that journal articles and conferences would generate interesting disagreements. But what usually happens is you get, schools of thought that operate like guilds, and they uh, build walls around themselves and defend themselves from others. And you end up not pursuing truth, but competing for research grants and prestige
mm,
and tenure. And so academia gets captured by these other dynamics that have nothing to do with actually learning from each other and from this, shared reality that we inhabit. And I think, I have more hope actually for this type of format
hmm,
and philosophy existing in the wild, as it were, than I do for academia. At least the current trends to me suggest that academia, universities are more and more captured by neoliberal market dynamics. And I mean, philosophy departments are being closed anyway. So
yeah,
we're
yeah,
going to have to do it online and out in the world, because universities have no place for deep thought for the sake of thought, right?
yeah,
That doesn't lead to, that doesn't train people well for corporate jobs, and that doesn't lead to research revenue flowing into the university. So
mm,
um, I think this type of conversation, um, and your way of engaging, Ishmael, I think is really, in a dark and darkening world. It's particularly in the way that we do the culture war stuff. I think your way of engaging is such a bright a light and a source of what's possible. And I hope that more people follow your model, because that's how philosophy should be practiced. It's less about what you believe. You're not out here defending a particular position. You're trying to get people to engage the questions in a different way, right?
yeah.
I think that's fair. I don't know if you feel that's a fair account of what you're doing here, but
No, I do. Yeah,
um,
that means the world. Thank you.
yeah. So keep it up. Um, but yeah, we should wrap it up.
Yep.
My blood sugar is dropping, and while I don't think the brain produces consciousness, it's definitely intimately related to it. And
Yeah.
I better get some
Correlated.
food in me.
Yeah, but thank you so much, everyone, and thank you so much, Matthew. This is truly awesome. I was incredibly excited when you agreed to talk, and yeah, especially as a a smaller creator, it definitely means the world to me, man. So thank you so much.
Let's do it again sometime. Yeah, I
Yeah,
appreciated this.
absolutely. Maybe we can talk about what's his name, Rudolf Steiner.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah,
Let's do that.
yeah, let's do it.
Great.
but yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and I'll talk to you all soon. Have a good night.
Bye bye.